thank you for joining us on this special edition of KREM 2 News. I'm Brandon T. Jones, and we're streaming on KREM 2 Plus. Just moments ago, we learned a Spokane County judge has agreed to dismiss the case against Kevin Coe, also known as the South Hill Rapist. This follows a hearing in Spokane County courtrooms that just minutes ago wrapped up. Kevin Coe now set to be released to a care facility. Coe is believed responsible for upwards of 40 sexual assaults between the late 1970s and early 80s. During his first trial, Coe was convicted on only one count of rape. Following his arrest in 1981, Coe's single rape conviction led to a 25-year prison sentence, and in 2006, he was set to be released. Instead, the state argued he was still a sexually violent predator, and he was involuntarily committed to McNeil Island from 2008 until today. Now 78 years old, Attorney General's office says due to Coe's heart disease, limited mobility, and ongoing mental health issues, he's unlikely to re-offend. Coe will be a registered sex offender for life and will likely go to an adult group home. And again, we want to go ahead and bring back Attorney Steve Graham. We were talking with you a little bit earlier this morning ahead of this hearing, Steve. And one of the questions that I asked you was about what kind of impact these victim statements could have on the judge. And can you just walk us through kind of what we just watched, kind of what we heard in that courtroom, and kind of just that overall process?
Yeah. Well, you could tell it was hard for the judge because her hands were tied. I mean, legally, if the Attorney General's office says he's to be released, then she has to release him. She really can't overrule the state in that respect. But she kind of erred on the safe side and still heard from all the survivors, in the court. It was hard for her. You could see some impatience on the judge's part with the Attorney General's office in the way, it was kind of presented. But at the end of the day, she signed the order. He's released. He's free to go, and I guess on his way to a care facility.
Yeah, well, you could feel the, the trauma, the hurt, especially from those victims inside of that courtroom. And Judge Julie McKay, she deems that these statements, it won't impact the ultimate release of Kevin Coe. But again, what do you feel like she was going through in those moments as, she's hearing some of these testimonies from these victims who many still in a lot of pain, still trying to process and still trying to live life with this trauma that they got from decades ago?
You bet. I think it's hard for a judge to listen to that, and she's probably frustrated that, she can't really do more. But at the end of the day, there's, her hands are tied and she signed the order. Judges are people too, and they, it hits them hard to see that suffering that those 5 women, endured over the years. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that was very hard on her.
Yeah, and Steve, I've got a couple of quotes here just from some of those victim statements that we heard from a lot of people. A lot of them were in their early 20s, some teenagers, now 60-year-old women that they've had to process this pain and what they went through during that time period. But something a few of them said is that they want to see this kind of process change, and so they accepted that Kevin Coe would be released because of the ruling of the state, but they also kind of made a call to action saying, hey, just because his health is declining doesn't mean he isn't still mentally ill or could still possibly be a threat to society.
Yeah. Well, it's a little hard because the law has been changed and it applies to cases in modern era, but, Kevin Coe, to some extent, was sentenced under the laws of the late 70s and early 80s. And there's been a lot of legislative changes to empower the state to hold people for longer. But under current law, if someone's deemed no longer a danger by the psychologist, then the state's powerless to hold them. And I think the public, is apprehensive about all this, because how do we know he doesn't physically recover and goes back out into society from this care home and endanger others, or perhaps endangers other people in the care home. So, I think that elected leaders are listening to see if there can be some improvement in the law.
Yeah, and that's something that was also mentioned by victims who said, hey, how do we know this isn't the long game for him? And, calling him a psychopath and, potentially, someone who might be even, faking the current status that he's in. So I guess that leads to my next question, because we talked about, maybe how challenging it was for the judge who's sitting in that seat to have to sign that paper. How difficult do you think it was just for these victims who, even though, decades ago, that still lives in their head, just as if it was, maybe yesterday or, not that long ago?
Well, you can certainly say they never really do recover, even 5 decades later. I think that's something that's very powerful for the court. The judge has heard a lot of statements in her career as a judge. It's hard, it's hard, I mean, the nature of a sociopath is they're very manipulative. And the psychologist assessed his brain, but there really wasn't anything in the record about a doctor specializing in geriatric medicine assessing him physically and his potential dangerousness physically to make sure he wasn't malingering. So, yeah, that's hard. I mean, that's what troubles the victims there. In the court file, there's a couple hundred pages of psychological assessments, but no real physical assessment. So leaves people wondering, I guess.
Well, Steve, we certainly appreciate you, just taking some time out of your day.
Of course.
Watching that hearing with us, walking us through it as well. And we do want to give a little bit more background on this particular case. But here's a look back on Coe's high-profile trial. Again, this was a national upwards of 40 sexual assaults between the late 70s and 80s. Coe was arrested in 1981, and during his first trial, Coe was convicted on 4 counts of sexual assault. Just 3 years later, the state Supreme Court overturned those convictions because some victims were said to be hypnotized during the police investigation. In the second trial in 1985, Coe was found guilty on 3 rape charges. Again, many of those were overturned on the hypnosis issue. And Coe's single rape conviction led to a 25-year prison sentence, and in 2006, he was set to be released. This case was full of surprises back in 1981, including Kevin Coe's mom, Ruth Coe, who was found guilty for trying to hire a man to murder the prosecutor and the judge who sent her son to prison. According to court documents, a tape recording was found with Ruth trying to pay $4,000 for the murders. And the recording saying, quote, "The job would look done would be humanity. It would look done would help humanity if it was done." During the trial, she was even defended by Carl Maxey, a nationally recognized civil rights leader here in Spokane, and she was sentenced to a year in county jail and given 10 years probation. So coming back out here again, and Steve, we just want to run another question by you. With your history of being in the courtrooms, how difficult is this to bring up a trial or a hearing, that happened decades ago, and to know that a lot of the victims, they're still alive, and a lot of the people here in Spokane, they still remember this vividly, and just rehashing a lot of that history?
Yeah, you bet. Oh, it's hard, and I think it's been a little bit of a history lesson for younger practitioners, lawyers, because of course in the 70s there was no DNA, there was no ring cams or license plate readers, or a lot of the forensic evidence we just take for granted. Yeah. So we kind of see Kevin Coe, he really kind of ran amok there on the South Hill, and the police really didn't have a lot of clues to really go on. And so it persisted. It wouldn't go on like that today because of the level of forensics and just the techniques that the police now have. So, I mean, he's one of the most prolific serial rapists in history.
Yeah.
And it was right here in our backyard. And so things have changed. You know, the law's changed. You know, we just heard about how someone was convicted of hiring, you know, a hitman and only did a year.
Yeah.
You know, we have mandatory sentencing now that's way different than the 70s and 80s. It's a completely different legal ecosystem than it was, you know, when in the 70s or 80s.
Well, yeah, and to think about the representation that, again, many who have passed on already. Yeah. And we talked about how difficult it was to hear some of those victim statements. Again, 5 women spoke in that courtroom today, talking about what they experienced, about being raped by Kevin Coe. And we're learning that we do have some of that sound that we can share with you. Again, 5 victims gave statements at Coe's release hearing today. Let's go ahead and take a listen from one of them.
September 9th, 1979, I had just gotten off work at KJRB radio station. For those of you that still come up and say Sunshine Shelley, same person, older version. That night, after Coe beat me almost to death, especially my face, and raped me and left me for dead in that field, there was a star in the sky. And he had told me during that night that he was going to kill me before he let me go. I had a tendency to believe him based on how badly he beat me. I looked up at that star and I started praying to God and asked him to please, the worst that he could do was kill me, just let me live. And I promised God that night that I would spend the rest of my life making sure that other victims, survivors as I like to call them, are able to get the help that they need to overcome that one horrible incident that happened. I too believe that we are survivors. If we were able to talk to Fred Coe, I would beg him to get help. I would beg for him to admit what he did, to ask forgiveness. I don't think that's going to happen. I too believe that the only way until he takes his last breath is that he asks God, Jesus Christ, for forgiveness. I too have forgiven him. I too feel free. It has allowed me to live a very good life. I use that word free because there's a lot to that. Many of us have lives where we have children and grandchildren. We're able to plant a garden. We're able to see the sunrise and see the sunset. None of us should ever consider, even after today, that Fred Coe is ever going to be free, because he will never be free. Satan has been a part of his life from the time he was a young adult and started doing these crimes. I would ask those that are still hurting, that still suffer from the incidents that happened to them, to remember that you are a survivor. Jesus is with you, and with that in your life, Satan will never win. And the same thing is with Fred Coe. You will never win. He is referred to me as what he calls his bad penny. When Dateline interviewed him, when he was still in Walla Walla, he wanted to know if they were going to interview me as well, and they did. And the producer said, she's a bad penny. And they asked him why he called me that. And he said, because she just won't go away. She won't shut up. And it's not me speaking right now. It's the Holy Spirit. And it fills you in a way that freedom is wonderful. And we all know that even when he walks out of McNeil Island, he will never be free unless his last breath is what he does by asking God forgiveness. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, that was Shelley Monahan, who we just heard from in those victim statements. But still ahead on this special edition of KREM 2 News, Kevin Coe, also known as the South Hill Rapist, officially released after being in custody for over 40 years. Our coverage continues in just 2 minutes. Welcome back to this special edition of KREM 2 News. We're continuing to track the breaking news this morning. Kevin Coe, also known as the South Hill Rapist, has been released. Today, the state says it doesn't have proof Kevin Coe is a sexual predator any longer. KREM 2's Shannon Mowdy looks back at the case ahead of this decision.
Kevin Coe has served 4 decades in prison and civil commitment, but it looks like that time will end this week. Though it's not the first time Coe was set to walk free. Coe was believed responsible for upwards of 40 sexual assaults between the late 70s and his arrest in 1981. He ultimately served time for just 1 rape. During his first trial, Coe was convicted on 4 counts of rape. Just 3 years later, the state Supreme Court overturned those convictions because some victims were hypnotized during the police investigation. In a second trial in 1985, Coe was found guilty on 3 charges. Again, many of those were overturned on the hypnosis issue. Coe's single rape conviction led to a 25-year prison sentence, and in 2006, he was set to be released. Instead, the state argued he was still a sexually violent predator. He was involuntarily committed to McNeil Island in 2008. After a jury agreed he was still a danger to the public. 2 separate experts recently concluded Coe, now 78 years old, is in failing health. A Department of Social and Health Services psychologist and another hired by the Attorney General's office say due to Coe's heart disease, limited mobility, and ongoing mental health issues, he's unlikely to reoffend. While the Attorney General's office is not fighting his release, a spokesperson says Coe will be a registered sex offender for life.
All right, and in that story we just heard about hypnosis, and so we've got attorney Steve Graham here to walk us through what we heard in today's hearing. But Steve, again, going back to that previous story we just heard, the question that comes to my mind is, what exactly does that mean? The hypnosis, there's trials thrown out because of hypnosis. What does that mean?
Well, we discussed a little bit about how the investigatory techniques were different in the 70s and 80s. And one thing that would sometimes come up is they would use hypnosis to help a survivor's recollection improve, and so it was used to assist the survivors in identifying Mr. Coe of a lineup when they couldn't do it. And they didn't do it with all the victims, but they did it in some of the cases, and it caused the convictions to get overturned on appeal.
Wow.
So they don't do things like that anymore, the police, but out of desperation, it was a tactic that they resorted to, in the 80s, early 80s.
So ultimately, they were trying to get this conviction so he could serve time in prison for some of these assaults that, of course, that he's been accused of, and basically it backfired.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. They tried to do everything they could, and this was deemed not appropriate.
Yes, sir. All right, well, thank you, Steve. We appreciate that. And still ahead here on this special edition of KREM 2 News, Kevin Coe, also known as the South Hill Rapist, officially released after being in custody for over 40 years. So our coverage continues in just 2 minutes, but if we can turn back to you, Steve, really quick, just for another question, because we've been talking a little bit about these victim statements, and we heard from Shelly Monahan, who, she talked about that forgiveness. She talked about how she's been able to find a little bit of peace, but then there was other victims who said, they don't believe they're ever going to be able to go to sleep at night peacefully, or they're always going to be looking over their shoulder now. So I don't know, what's that process like? As as the state signs off and says they don't believe he's a threat anymore, and how do they ultimately come to that conclusion?
Yeah, sure, but the stakes are real high. It all started with, they do these yearly reviews when someone's held as a sexually violent predator, and Coe's lawyers wanted a review, and they wanted an assessment. And their experts said Mr. Coe, was too frail and feeble to be a threat. And so the state, the Attorney General, they got a second opinion, and that psychologist agreed. So, they file a petition, a joint petition on both sides to release Mr. Coe. And, And it's hard. It wasn't done lightly. You know, maybe some lawyers would want a third opinion. You know, a third opinion, but, you know, that wasn't done. You know, it wasn't based that psychologically he's healed. He's still a predator in that respect. He's unrepentant, but just that he's of such an age and such a state of infirmary that he's just not a threat to people. He's just not physically able.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of a gamble there.
Yes, sir. Well, again, you're watching a special edition of KREM 2 News. We appreciate you, Steve. And coming up in just a few moments, our coverage will continue on the release of Kevin Coe. Special edition of KREM 2 News. We're continuing to track breaking news at this hour. Kevin Coe, also known as the South Hill Rapist, has been released following a hearing this morning. KREM 2's Amanda Rowley is live outside the courthouse with reaction this morning. And Amanda, you've been there. What has the energy there been like, and what has the overall feeling been like there at the courtroom?
Yeah, the overall feeling here, and excuse me, and we're speaking a little softly. We are just down the hallway from the courtroom where this release hearing happened. The energy in the courtroom is just somber and heartbreak, really. Many of the victims who spoke today embraced each other and their loved ones, full of tears and again, heartbreak. It's heartbreaking to be here and see that. Again, that ruling is in fact to release Kevin Coe. We do have a few of the survivors still here in the courthouse. Right now we are waiting to hear from the Spokane County prosecutor. He is meeting with them, those survivors, privately in a jury room to share their thoughts from their office privately. We did just a few moments ago receive a press release from the Superior Court administrator. Court resolves disputed matters. There was no dispute between the parties for the court to resolve, so the court could not force the state to keep pursuing the case. Lawyers have an ethical obligation to pursue cases when they cannot legally prove their case. The dismissal order is without prejudice, which means the state could refile the case if it believes evidence relating to it has evidence relating to risk changes. The Superior Court press release also acknowledges that it respects how the cases involving Kevin Coe profoundly affect the Spokane community and those survivors. We heard the judge saying, you know, her hands are tied, and at this point procedurally there was nothing that in procedure that would keep him in involuntary confinement. Again, right now we could be any moment hearing from the prosecutor. They wanted to make this statement to the survivors in court for the record, but the judge asked that be done privately. So we are waiting to hear from him what those comments were. We'll be sharing that here shortly when they leave that office.
Well, Amanda, during this hearing, you could feel all of those emotions and these victims sharing their different perspectives, a lot of them saying they have found forgiveness for Kevin Coe, but a lot of them still understandably so traumatized. Have you heard from any of those victims about potentially what's next and just how they're processing all of the events from today?
Shelley Monahan, we know her from broadcast here in our community, and we spoke with her ahead of the hearing today, and her sentiment was that the Spokane community is strong and it will remain strong despite this heartbreaking ruling. In her statement today, she talked about the moment that she was attacked by Kevin Coe, and she said she locked in and looked at a star in the sky, and she said that just gave her hope, and she's continued to speak about her experience in hopes of supporting the other survivors and giving them hope and strength to move on and move forward. And many of the victims that we heard from today did say that they forgive him, but they had hoped that he would not be released. That's just kind of the overall feeling across the board with these survivors today.
One more question for you, Amanda. You mentioned that I believe a prosecutor wanted to make a statement at the end of that hearing. So right now, is it still an option? Are they heading back into that courtroom? I know the judge mentioned a recess, but is there a window still for them to head back into the courtroom to make that statement?
The statement that we're expecting to hear from the prosecutor, that is not in the courtroom. The judge called for recess, and right after the judge called for recess, County Prosecutor Preston McCollum stepped forward asking to put their statement on the record. The judge denied that and said they can do that privately. So they left the courtroom and went into a private office. It's a jury room just right next to the courtroom. That is where all of the survivors gathered, are currently meeting with the prosecutor to hear their thoughts. It's going a little bit longer than we expected, but we do hope to hear some of the general points of what he shared with them. It's kind of an ebb and flow. We have seen some of the survivors leave. Shelley Monahan left right away, right after the hearing, and slowly we've seen some of the other survivors leave the courthouse. But I do believe the prosecutor is still in that jury room speaking to one other survivor, and we are hoping to hear what his thoughts were.
Amanda, thank you so much. Again, KREM 2's chief journalist Amanda Rowley live at the Spokane County Courthouse right now. You're watching a special edition of KREM 2 News. We'll be right back here after the break. Special edition of KREM 2 News, and we're now wrapping up our coverage on Kevin Coe, the man known as the South Hill Rapist. Today, a judge released Coe, and we're turning now to local attorney Steve Graham. Steve, you've been here with us. You watched the hearing with us as well. Another question that I've got for you is that what happens if he reoffends? If he's released and he's caught in the act again, or he harms another person, what happens at that point?
Well, he'll be, the most closely watched man in the state, that's for sure. I mean, everybody knows his history. And so, any prosecutor in Spanaway or anywhere else will keep a close eye on him. And if there's any sort of misconduct of any sexual variety, he could be, committed again. So really the next chapter is up to him. But he's been given this chance late in life, and if there's any sort of misconduct, he could be arrested, charged, recommitted, go back to prison, not just the civil commitment. So we'll just have to see how that unfolds. If he's as feeble and frail as he's let on, well, he'll live the rest of his days in that care home. And never leave. No. But he's not locked up. There's no EHM bracelet or anything. So if he recovers, he's free to go back into the community. But we'll just have to see.
Yes, sir. So likely spending the rest of his days on the west side of the state.
That's right.
What's your overall takeaway from this hearing that we watched and listened in to this morning?
Well, it's real gut-wrenching, for everybody to kind of see this. But I think it's important to see, our elected officials to see, the public to see how much has changed in the system. We now have a Victim Bill of Rights in the state constitution. We have a lot more sophisticated investigations. We have more female detectives out there. We have more trauma-centered, victim-centered investigations. We have better techniques like DNA to, help exonerate the falsely accused. The system's better for the improvements made in the last 50 years.
Sir. Well, Steve, we certainly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak with us, to walk us through this hearing. And thank you for joining us today as well. We'll have more coverage coming up on KREM 2 News at noon. In the meantime, you can catch this full special and more coverage on Kevin Coe right here on KREM 2 Plus.